Welcome back, my friends. Rick Widener here on KNZZ, KGLN, and a bunch of other stuff. We are here at 1100, 980, 101.8 or 108.1. I can't remember. And then 97.2 and whatever you're listening to. We're all over the place. Eastern Utah, Western Colorado. Thanks for joining us again. Couldn't be happier to have you. What I have to say is, another week. Living under the shadow of a demented Muppet and his associates. But that's okay, because it reminds me of how precious our freedoms and the genius of our founders are as we watch it trying to be torn apart and the difficulty they have doing it. So that in and of itself should tell us something. The other thing I was thinking about, and I know this is sometimes a little strange, but we do things a little differently on this show lots of times. When I was coming in to do this today, I was thinking, and this is directly a result of reading too much ancient literature in my spare time, what that I have of it, this last week. I read a little bit of Tacitus, the Annals of Imperial Rome, and little Thucydides, and, I looked at something by Herodotus. I didn't really read it, just because sometimes I feel it's important to dive deep back to where the germ of all the ideas that we have today really started from. And it's always, I think, helpful to do that. But the point of that is I started thinking this age-old question comes up everywhere, at least everywhere that's free. And that is, what is the real aim, the mission of civil government? I mean, we spend so much time, especially now, fighting against things that we know cannot be right in terms of governing a free people, that sometimes it's hard to really encapsulate if somebody asks you that, what should the best form, or at least the best form that we can imagine at this point in time, of civil government look like? And we know what the founders, the framers of our Constitution, thought it should look like. And it's pretty darn good. And that helps us because it gives us that jumping off point. And we see the success of it, because that's the test, isn't it? That's why we study history, or should, kind of out of fashion now, except to bring stuff up to, bash something that you're upset about. Because it's the laboratory, right? It's where you experiment with things. It's how you understand what happens when two things are combined. It's just like chemistry. What happens when you do this? Well, it makes something better, makes something useful. If we combine these other two things together, they blow up. That's how you know. Time passes, and you try and not mix the things together that blow up. But you keep it in the back of your mind, because who knows? Maybe you might need something that blows up one of these days. Maybe that's how that you invent, if you're Alfred Nobel and you decide to invent dynamite. Something like that. But nevertheless, it's an experiment. It's a laboratory. I just like saying it that way because it sounds very sort of, Victor Frankenstein kind of thing, the laboratory. But it is the laboratory of government and humanity, its history. It's the notebooks. Imagine it that way. Imagine that some great experimenter has been working away at mixing various forms of humanity and different ways of governing them and so forth over thousands of years. And they've kept notebooks about what the results were. We did this, and then that happened, and then that happened, and then we did this. And you had access to those notebooks. Wouldn't that be a treasure trove? Wouldn't that be something in many ways is worth more than gold? Because it tells you what works, what helps people live better. Well, we have that. We just don't want to look at it in some instances. Our schools don't want to see it because it goes against the political narrative. It's not unlike many times in history. A particular faction falls out of favor. It happened in England a number of times, actually also in France, but England is a great example where there were certain dynasties, if you want to call them that, rather families that were rulers, and they sort of fell out of favor. And if you were a Tudor, you weren't so crazy about hearing things discussed about how great the Plantagenets were, right? That kind of thing permeates history. The people that are in control sometimes have access to the pen and paper because they have the money or the power. So it can get shaded, but for the most part, we have pretty good idea about what's happened. And when you see people trying not to examine it and not teach it like in our schools, that tells you something. It tells you that they know there's things in there that they don't want you or your children or your children's children to know. And that means that by all things holy, you need to know those things. I have a card on my desk, my credenza actually, and I've quoted it probably here before because I think it's so important, from the French philosopher Voltaire, not his real name. And he says, if you wonder who governs you, see who it is you are not allowed to criticize. I think that is that's the test. Once again, it's like chemistry. It tells you something by the reaction you get. If you place criticism, let's call it the chemical of criticism, against that of power, and you can't find where power is exactly because it hides a little bit. It hides behind institutions. It hides behind, useful idiots. We know many of those, don't we? And so if you want to see where it is, though, push out the active catalyst of criticism and see where the suppression comes from. See where the reaction comes from. That will tell you who's either in charge or trying to be in charge or who is secretly in charge. It's a really interesting experiment. But we get back to the idea of what do we want government really to look like? Like I say, we have a tremendous blueprint to work from. We have our Constitution, and we see what's happened to it over time. We see what things have been workable and what things we've had to change, and some of the things we've changed, we needed to change back. I mentioned, prohibition, for instance. But there's other things that we see where they're probably not as perfect as we would have liked, but by and large, it's a genius document, and it has shown us how it's operated in the United States over a fair amount of time. We, in America, don't have the sense of history some places do. Now, that's good and bad. A lot of places that have a tremendous history can't get past it in the sense that they become slaves to the dead hands of tradition and their own prejudices. New countries like ourselves don't usually have that. On the other hand, we don't have the guidance of those traditions, which they work both ways. And so each thing has its own suggestion of efficiency. But what we see now in essentially a managerial, administrative, technocrat class gone mad is the opportunity to say, well, we see what part does not work. And these things don't work. So how do we stack those up against things that do? Well, we can see what works in the past where we had a similar economy, right? We had, let's say at the time of Calvin Coolidge, good old Silent Cal, probably one of the most underrated presidents ever, and certainly the most underrated president in the 20th century. And because he's underrated, because he felt America should be left, for the most part, alone. And his job was to facilitate the business of America and let America get on about its business and become what it needs to be. And that he felt that government had a certain outside job to do, which is to protect the governed, the people underneath the shield of government that protects them from outside enemies and things like that, but to interfere only when absolutely necessary. And we had tremendous results from that. So you compare that with constant, endless picking and rearranging, and this, we had it under Franklin Roosevelt, we've had it under all the Democrats for the last 40 years here, really bad for the last year for sure, and we can see that difference. That begins to tell us where we should head. I'll be back in a minute, folks.